The boys, he said, were beaten with their clothes on, badly beaten with their clothes on. All of their clothes were recovered. There was no blood on them. He said that Baldwin called him at noon to say that the murders were completed. Jason Baldwin, like all of these victims, was in school at noon. And finally, they take this statement to a judge. He refuses to give a warrant. He says, you've given me a statement that doesn't describe these crimes. They occurred in the evening, not in the morning. They go back to Ms. Kelly in the interrogation and tell him that he had said that it was 8 o'clock at night, which he never had. They supplied the time. And even though we now know it's in the evening, and Baldwin, Ms. Kelly has described this as in the morning, there's never an explanation given of how he ever could have run into Echols or Baldwin, whose movements during that day were accounted for. So when Gary Gitchell says 11 out of 10, he's talking about 0 on a scale of 10. So where do we go from there? The authentic assessment of the evidence as Echols' trials began came from the prosecutors.
Unfortunately, we need his testimony real bad. If it was a perfect world, we would take what we have on Jesse and leave it, and we'd go and get the other two and get them and be happy, but it's not. And we need his testimony to be sure we get convictions on the other two.
What happens then is that what Brent Davis is saying is that the statement of Ms. Kelly is not only false and unreliable, it's inadmissible against either Echols or Baldwin. In this country, you can't put in a statement like that. You have to put a witness on the stand to be cross-examined. He is saying that unless we get Jesse Ms. Kelly on the stand to give a credible version of this, we don't think we can win the case. And John Fogelman, the other prosecutor at that point, summarizes what they have without Ms. Kelly.
So that's what we've got, but that's all, basically, that we've got. And you ask what the odds were of convicting them without Jesse, and it's 50-50 might be good.
And what they're talking about is that there's a statement by the Hollingsworth clan that two members of the Hollingsworth family who said they saw Damien Echols and his girlfriend, who was related to them, Dominique Tare, on that evening out on the road not far from the crime scene. There's fibers from little children's clothing that were recovered on at the crime scene, that the theory being that somehow a little shirt in Echols' home had a fiber transferred to him and it got to the crime scene. There were two girls at a softball game who said they heard Echols say he killed the boys and he would kill two more. They mentioned Michael Carson, and you'll be seeing from him a jailhouse informant who said that Jason Baldwin made an incriminatory statement. And he said, and this is absolutely critical to what you're hearing today, he said, Fogelman says, we found a knife in a lake behind the home of Jason Baldwin, the knife in the lake. But did Jesse, Ms. Kelly, testify at the trial? No, he did not. He had maintained his innocence after this statement. He never testified for the state. Well, if that's the case, given what you saw, how did they get the conviction against Damien Echols? We'll be discussing each of these things again later, but one thing was absolutely critical to that conviction and to our presentation today. In the closing argument...
Is it a coincidence that this knife is found in the lake, hidden behind Jason Baldwin's house? There are marks on Christopher Byers where you've got like a dash where it's a cut, an open space, a cut, and an open space. And if you take this knife and do that, you can see it leaves a cut and an open space, cut and an open space. Now, if you take this knife, Defense Exhibit 6, and even with the slightest pressure, it makes a straight line.
So what have you just seen? The prosecutor has said that if you take a grapefruit and cut it with that big knife that you saw, you will get that is a fair representation of what a knife does to human flesh. He has said that there's a certain pattern that would be made on the grapefruit, same as made on human flesh by that knife, and he concludes by saying, so therefore you know this knife found in the lake was what was responsible, remember, for the sexual mutilation of Chris Byers. None of that was supported by any evidence in the record. The state's pathologist said nothing more than this, that he could identify of hundreds of marks on these bodies. He said hundreds. He picked out three spots that could have been made by a serrated knife, but any serrated knife. He could not attribute to anything. But you watched the prosecutor conduct an experiment which he represented to the jury, proved conclusively that the same marks on that grapefruit had been made by that same knife on the body of Chris Byers. Now what do we know about what convinced the jury to convict? Remember, Jesse Misskelley did not testify. Jesse Misskelley's statement could never serve as any evidence in the case against Echols and Baldwin, because in this country, evidence comes from the witness stand. Every jury is told you will decide this case on the evidence from the witness stand. But in the last couple of years, quite fortuitously, and this is the sort of fortune that can save a man's life, we have found the following. We have found that there was, even at the time, it was known that the jury put up big sheets of factors that they considered in convicting Echols and Baldwin. And they've been kept in evidence. And here the Echols one is. And people have examined this for years. But no one has really asked what that might be. What was that? Why was it crossed out? Who crossed it out? Years later, an investigator for Jason Baldwin named Tom Quinn found one of the jurors who had not only taken compendious notes, but had copied a facsimile of that list into her notebook. The crossed out item is the Jesse Misskelley testimony. The same is true of the Jason Baldwin list. You will also see something crossed out on the Baldwin list. The woman's facsimile reveals, the juror's facsimile reveals, it is the Jesse Misskelley statement. Jesse Misskelley, Jason Baldwin, and Damien Echols were convicted illegally in violation of every basic principle of a fair trial because they were convicted by jurors on evidence that not only the jurors had never heard, but they couldn't have heard. And most importantly, had that statement been admitted, those jurors would have heard the 11 reasons why it was false. Because it was not admitted, because the defense was under the impression the jury didn't know about it or wouldn't rely on it, they didn't hear any of that evidence about how false it was. All they knew was the reports in newspapers that said consistently Misskelley identified these two defendants as murdering and raping these three victims. So that is the trial. That is the central claim, that unfairness, reliance on the Misskelley statement in Echols versus Norris. But with that, I would like to reach the question of, in addition to that, the unfairness of the trial, what is the new evidence that proves not merely that this was an unfair trial, but that innocent men were convicted, in particular Damien Echols. And with that, I'll turn to Don Horgan, who's going to introduce our expert.
Good morning. I'm going to take a minute or two here just to review some of the DNA evidence that has recently surfaced in the case, first with a little background. In 2001, Arkansas, like a lot of other states, passed a statute that allows convicted criminal defendants to challenge their convictions with new DNA evidence that shows them to be actually innocent. Under that state statute, and under an agreement the defendants reached with the prosecution, relevant items from the crime scene in this case were tested at the laboratory chosen by the prosecution, and that's Bodie Laboratories in Virginia.